All right. So I just graded the week 9 Learn Together, and it's, good job. There was people with a variety of ways that they looked at and accomplished this code, which was awesome and always what I like to see. So I just want to say a couple words about like what we're doing next week, because yesterday I recorded week 10 Learn Together, and I think, did I see somebody go ahead and attempt it this week? I have to double check, but I know in my example I did. And it's the idea that we're moving to persistent storage, right? And next week, and here's the other thing I want you to keep in mind is when you finish week 10's Learn Together, or week 10's coding and then week 10's Learn Together, pretty much you have everything you need to work on Dev 1. What you learn in section 9, like if I was to just pull up, just it'd be good for me to validate what I'm thinking here, because sometimes I remember wrong. It does happen sometimes. But in here, yeah, so week 9, section 9 is all about expanding our knowledge of JavaScript. So it's not necessarily that we're going to learn some new commands, but we'll learn to write some things new like ternary and understanding truthy and falsy. We may have been using them, but not understanding them, coercion, throwing errors. But arrow function is probably the most important there. So what I'm saying is that although you will be refactoring some of your functions, you have everything you need after this code up, or everything that is required, except for arrow functions. Those are really just writing functions differently that you need to do Dev 1. And the important thing for what I'm trying to say is we're moving to persistent storage, right? And I've talked about this before, but understanding that what we were doing in week 9 Learn Together was capturing, getting that user data. And again, you're going to hear me emphasize CRUD, right? Create, read, update, and delete. So CRUD operations is really what we're doing here. Okay. So create, read, update, and delete. And what we're doing to implement those concepts of, course, event listeners, inputs, HTML inputs, grabbing the values out of those inputs. And I think most of you, and I did as well, used a drop down for the filing status. And you'll see next week I implemented some validation. And that's the other thing is like what I would say is from here on out, at minimal required on the inputs, but you need to write some additional validation or handle it somehow. And you'll see the way that I do it next week by adding some CSS for validation, which is a fun way to do it, because then you have multiple levels of because there's generally not just one error, because it's like if you set a field for number, then the user can't enter an alpha, can only enter a number, cannot enter an alphabetical number or an alphabetical character. But what that does is it doesn't validate maybe a range that you would want the user to limit their input to. Okay. So you have to think about all the different ways. And this is true. A user will screw up a form. I mean, they will. It's what I do it. Like I'll be filling out something, and I always appreciate it when the developer allows me to make an error, but doesn't punish me for it, right? Allows and shows me the error I'm making, either by highlighting something, CSS, something, or gives me some kind of visual cue that I've made an error in the form. And it used to bug me so bad, and I don't see it as much anymore, where if you made one error, they'd clear the entire form. Now, speaking of that, the one thing I did see on a couple of submissions last night was that whenever a user submits your form and you have captured that data and written and updated the DOM, you want to clear those inputs, right? You want to make sure so that the user can then enter new, and you don't want to keep that previous data on there. So just be aware of that. And the other thing, and I think I only saw one person doing this, but it's worth noting, is that we're also moving away from the idea of display on page, right? So you really should no longer, and I hate to say should, right? But here's the what when we were using display on page, you were passing it a string, and then I had some commands that you now understand better because of the course, which is document.create element, and that you can create the elements that you want dynamically. So and again, I hesitate to say should, but no longer will you need that display on page because you will render to the DOM by creating your elements dynamically. Okay, so few concepts there that I hope you walk away with. And the last one, and although nobody's done this, I want you to know one of the things that we talk about in development is called separation of concerns. So what you want to do is you want your HTML to be just your HTML. You want your CSS, right? And you don't want to mix your HTML and your CSS, right? You don't want to inline your CSS into your HTML, nor do you want to run or activate your JavaScript functions from within your HTML. It's very common when you're looking on the web. You can find so many good bad examples of JavaScript. But in this class, and as a standard, and I will update the coding style sheet that I gave for Dev 1 for Dev 0 for Dev 1, is that do not write JavaScript function calls or invoke functions from within your HTML. It's just not the way we do it, because what we want to do is separate our concerns into their appropriate locations so that we're not mixing and matching. Because when you're doing web development, you can definitely do it, it'll work, but it is not a good practice. I know that was a lot. The other thing I'm going to say is about organization. In week 10, now first in week 9, I'm sitting here looking at mine. And by the way, again, you should be using DevTools. Even if you didn't need DevTools to troubleshoot your code or to debug your code, you really should continue to use it, because you would want to understand how it works so that you're more and more comfortable with it. Because a hesitancy to go to DevTools doesn't serve you well, especially if you're new to this. Okay. I've noticed some of the people who are in this class that have more experience tend not to go into DevTools. And I'm just going to tell you, don't resist it because it'll help you. So, like if I was to, I'm looking at my app, and that's the other thing, is organizing like your app to really be those things that are either global in nature, and or your event listeners should really set in your app. And you'll see this organization, he'll cover this in next week's or this week's code along. And you should just do this as a good practice. And then putting your functions in a different file so that, really it's just a better way to organize things, and your files are going to get really longer as we implement more and more functionality. So DevTools set those breakpoints, right? And then again, because this is inside the form, the event listener, I'm not going to see that dev tool or that breakpoint take effect until I actually enter some data. Okay. So that's when I would see that dev tool, that line, that setting that breaking, that point. God, why am I having a hard time with that? But setting that breaking point, that point to stop your code, and then walking through, right? So in here, what I did in my code was I set up an object, and then I passed that object into my determine the amount. Then I returned in here, right? So if I was to step into this, you can see like, here's my request. It's set up from grabbing these. And by the way, I did it a little differently. I did form, and then I did because that when if you were just, and by the way, this is the other thing, right? I've talked about this, but if you want to look at, like, if I wanted to look at form EL, right, that shows me that that's a representation of that DOM, but also I can pull the different inputs by, because it's an array like object. Okay, so I can drill down by using this, and it's just another way to do it, besides using e.target.value. Okay. Okay, I know this is a lot, and I really enjoyed listening or reading your thinking on Dev 1. And I said this last week, so I'll say it again, is that Dev 1, that week that you can come see me before it's due, will be the week we get back from spring break. Cool? So, and I'll talk about this probably because next week, week 11, yeah, I'll probably talk about this more, but just know that I'm actually going to take spring break off this year. Sometimes I work and I actually may work ahead on some code, but in general, I take break, which I say if you can do, take a break, but if you're also trying to get caught up, that's not a bad time to do it as well. So, that's it. Have a great weekend. It's beautiful weather in Central California, and I'm going to go enjoy it. So, peace out.